Tegel Prison, West Berlin. This man, Horst Mahler, was once a respected lawyer. Now he's a convicted terrorist sentenced to 14 years in jail. Mahler founded the Red Army faction, often known as the Baader-Meinhof Group, Europe's most ruthless terrorist gang. He wanted a socialist revolution in Germany. The method he and his comrades used was to unleash a wave of terror. Tonight, World in Action inquires into Mahler's attitude to political violence as he faces 7 more years behind bars. The terrorism Mahler initiated continues today. Many innocent people have died. Was this Mahler's intention in taking up arms?
We realized that it is not appropriate and it is not responsible to kill people in our actions.
But if that is the case, why did you spend 3 months learning weapons training?
You must, to avoid dangerous situations, be trained to get out of such situations. And we were determined, if we are trapped or attacked by police, we would defend ourselves.
But you were already the first to shoot when Baader was freed and person was wounded.
It was quite clear that somebody else was shot down. Was a breakdown of nerves by one of the participants in this action. And it was, I guess, not an accident in the real sense of the word, but something like an accident. He got out of his control.
If you go with a gun and you have a bullet in it and you go to break the law,
yes,
then you're prepared to kill. You're prepared to shoot.
Yes.
Do you think that was justified to free Baader, a man who'd set fire to a department store?
We thought then it would be justified to shoot and even to kill one of these guards when they take the gun to shoot us. This was the point.
It wasn't an armed guard whom the terrorists shot in freeing their comrade Andreas Baader from jail, but an innocent old man. The first clue to what put Mahler, now 42, on the road to prison was to be found in his childhood.
I grew up in a family who was very close, and I loved my parents, and I never could understand when I read in the books what fascism was, what war was, what the concentration camps meant. But they didn't want to discuss about fascism. And if somebody told them there are concentration camps and the Jews are murdered in these camps, they said that's only propaganda by our enemies. That's not true. When I grew up and became a little bit more conscious, it was quite inevitable to think about these events, about fascism. And this was in opposition to the generation before, the generation of our parents.
The 1960s, the era of student revolt all over Europe. In Germany, many in Horst Mahler's generation took to the streets to demonstrate. Like him, they attacked their parents for their fascist past, their political apathy, and their obsessive materialism. They turned against the American war in Vietnam, and they demanded revolution. The authorities overreacted. The muddled brutality of the police led to street battles unknown since wartime.
Many students were beaten down, heavily injured, many in critical conditions. One was killed. And this made an uproar of public emotion in our country because it changed the minds of many people. And then I was a bourgeois lawyer here in Berlin. And as soon as the SDS students got trouble with the police, they contacted me to defend them in court. And this was the way I got involved in this student movement of the late 60s.
Mahler would leave the courts to speak at protest meetings like this one, where he addressed the students alongside their leader, Rudi Dutschke. The prosperous lawyer had now become the champion of the left-wing cause. Outside the courts, the demonstrations continued. In 1966, for the first time, a student was killed by the police. Again, Horst Mahler was involved.
And they tried first to say he was not shot, he was killed by accident by a club or something else. And then I found out, I took part in the medical investigation at his body, and I saw he was shot. And so I made it open and informed, and they couldn't deny, and so it became quite clear it had been a murder.
Mahler, the establishment lawyer, was at the center of the storm. He charged the police with breach of the peace and murder. These trials brought him vast publicity and a growing left-wing clientele, which included many who later followed him into terrorism. Men like Fritz Teufel and Andreas Baader, whose political mentor Mahler became.
And they knew I didn't only defend them in court, I took part in the demonstrations in the street. And this was new for Germany, because it is, for a German lawyer, it is not proper to take part in street demonstrations, you know.
By now, Horst Mahler was an established figurehead in the front line of the revolution in the streets. Then came the crunch. After the attempted assassination of Rudi Dutschke, the anger of demonstrators was turned against the right-wing press of newspaper magnate Axel Springer. Day by day, his papers had poured scorn on the students and their cause. Mahler himself clashed with the police. The riot lasted 3 days and nights. Buildings were besieged and dozens of cars set ablaze. For both sides, this was a key event. From now on, the authorities clamped down hard, and the student movement split into factions. Mahler, with his political friends, was still determined to bring about the revolution, by violence if necessary. The question was how.
We all knew that we have come to a turning point, to a frontier in our actions. Now we knew that we must do something. We were common in views about violence. This was a common point. But now the realization of this, I thought would be wrong, and I criticized it. And so they told me, if you know exactly what's wrong in our actions, and if you know how to do them properly, why don't you do that? And this was very impressive for me, and I thought about it. And so I made up my mind to realize my criticism. And I prepared myself, together with other people, to do something similar, but in another way, quite a different way, you know. And this was, for my personal development, the starting point to urban guerrilla of the Red Army faction.
Horst Mahler, the lawyer, had now become a committed terrorist. He invented the group's name and emerged as the strategist behind the Red Army faction. They were to make headlines across the world with their first move, the armed liberation of this man, Andreas Baader, then serving a sentence for arson in West Berlin. World in Action asked another early member of the Red Army faction, Hans-Jürgen Becker, for his recollection of the escape.
It happened for the first time in German history that a prisoner was freed from the hands of the police in an armed raid. The authorities were so shaken and shattered that they mobilized all they had at their disposal to get their prisoner back. So, a secure hiding place had to be found for Baader, and all the members who took part in the raid had to disappear as well and go underground.
Becker joined the guerrillas at the start. A month ago, he was released from the same prison in West Berlin where World in Action interviewed Horst Mahler. Becker had served 7 years for terrorist offences. He'd been one of the few manual workers in a group dominated by middle-class intellectuals. In contrast to Mahler, the theorist, Becker had to deal with the down-to-earth mechanics of survival.
One main difficulty was in getting hold of new passports. In my view, people were totally inexperienced, but everybody was willing to learn. At dances, passports were pinched from people when they were dancing. Another possibility, we broke into town halls and passport offices. It was dead easy, but I myself have never carried weapons for such trivialities.
As
far as I was concerned, a gun was like a screwdriver to a mechanic. It was just a tool. But I do know of people from the underground who constantly carried weapons. And I could not avoid the impression that for them they were, well, a boost to their masculinity. The weapon multiplied their virility. They in fact felt much stronger than they really were. I can attribute that only to their possession of a gun. And I find this attitude not right for a revolutionary with Marxist aspirations.
For the first time, we had to reorganize the underground. After the liberation of Bada, it was very dangerous to stay here in the city because the police was looking for him, it's quite clear. And we then had no infrastructure for the underground. And we missed the ability for this kind of struggle. And we thought it would be very useful to have some training. And so we contacted our Palestinian friends, and they gave us the opportunity first to go to another country, to be away.
You contacted your Palestinian friends here in Germany?
Yes.
Who were here in Germany?
Yes. We knew them since years, together with demonstrations against US imperialism. We were together.
A Palestinian training camp. In the summer of 1970, the Red Army faction, led by Mahler, arrived in Jordan. The journey had been difficult. Some came through East Berlin and Beirut on false passports, others through Italy.
Were there other nationalities there besides the Germans?
No.
You didn't meet any other European groups?
No. We were the only Europeans there.
Were you the first European group to go there?
In this kind, yes. They told us that this would be a new step in our relationships to them.
Later, the cooperation between the German Red Army faction and the Palestinian guerrillas was to have deadly consequences. But first, the Germans had to learn how to kill.
We trained with attack weapons such as machine guns, pistols, knives, and also heavier arms such as anti-aircraft guns and grenade throwers. But we didn't spend much time on them. We thought that city guerrillas in Berlin would not need anti-aircraft guns or grenade throwers. That would be ridiculous.
The weapons we thought would be useful, Kalashnikov, you know them. It's a very good one. And the machine gun is Dr. It was a kind of gun which are used in the Eastern countries, you know, and they got the guns from the Eastern countries. And we were trained with these guns.
There was friction because the Palestinians were all still very religious people who valued the Quran more than the Kalashnikov. And we didn't realize that. At that time, we didn't understand that the Palestinians, who were after all simple, unsophisticated people, still found their religion meaningful. Not showing enough respect for their religion created ill feelings. We even joked about it, which upset them very much.
The German and Palestinian guerrillas had other differences, not merely religious ones. They also clashed over the choice of training methods to suit their native battlegrounds.
Moving in a city is quite another thing than moving in the field. And so we had other problems and other techniques in the fighting. And we try to find out what the differences are. And then we wanted them, the Palestinians, to show us what we needed here for our situation here. And these were the differences.
After 3 months of hard training in the Middle East, Mahler and his fellow terrorists returned to West Berlin. Mahler's appearance had changed. The well-fed lawyer had acquired the lean looks of a guerrilla leader with a suntan, contact lenses and a wig. No one would recognize him, even in Berlin, a city where he was well known and where the police were hunting for them all. The Red Army faction were now trained to kill, but they had to learn what the Palestinians couldn't teach them, how to operate undercover in a city. Now a free man, Hans Becker recalls the tensions caused in the group by life on the run.
Life underground is, first of all, it is expensive. That's one side of it. But a person who lives underground for a longer time must go crackers. The paranoia sets in, so that in every person you meet you see a potential enemy, and that is quite horrible. The group were nervous, jumpy, aggressive, even against nice people, and that made me sad. We used strong, abusive language and had arguments that nearly turned into fights. Life underground was not at all harmonious. One was not too happy to live as we had to. I mean, it was all suffered in the name of the great goal and accepted. However, the great goal cannot prevent the mind from going nuts. Going underground is not playing cops and robbers like little children. It's a terribly difficult thing. There is not only the risk of physical death, the mind can die too.
Under the pressure of life on the run, the Red Army faction became nervous. They began to forget their political ideals and fell into acts of indiscriminate violence. In 1972, bombs exploded in a United States military base near Frankfurt. The target of the terrorists was American imperialism in Vietnam, but the result was 1 officer killed and 13 soldiers wounded.
How did you feel in prison at the time? Were you elated? Were you happy?
Honestly, my spontaneous reaction was not to think about the killed persons, the GIs, but to be glad about this demonstration of resistance against the American warfare as a highlight here in Germany, because we always missed the resistance against fascism, and we asked why our parents didn't resist Nazi dictatorship. We thought it would be necessary to attack individuals who are serving the state in these confrontations.
What kind of individuals?
What's the right word? Executioners. Also people who are going to the homes and throw people, the families, out of the house.
How did you want to attack them?
Yeah, arrest them in so-called Volksgefängnissen.
People's prison.
People's prisons. And to beat them. We saw people's prisons in connection with Peter Lorenz and Hans-Martin Schleyer. But this is only the technique. Maybe we thought something like the Red Brigades are doing now in Italy. This was the direction.
What the Red Brigades are doing now has shocked the world. At their hands, Aldo Moro, former Premier of Italy, suffered the ordeal which Mahler conceived almost 7 years before. He was kidnapped, held in a so-called people's prison, and then brutally murdered. The Red Brigades have closely followed Mahler's line.
The Red Brigades do other things similar to our ideas of a social revolutionary guerrilla. Attacks on Fiat personal managers and so. And this kind of intervention is part of such a strategy we had in mind, intervening in social struggles here in the country.
Did it trouble you at that time in 1970 that actually when you went underground and took first actions, you did not manage to get any support of the people?
No, because then we had a specific relation to our people. We thought they are corrupt by the welfare, by the quietness here in our area, and that they are corrupt and sympathizing with the oppressors.
For the great majority, the real oppressors were Mahler and the guerrillas, and worse was to come. Munich, 1972. The world's attention was focused on the Olympic Games. It was here that the German terrorists were overshadowed by their teachers, the Palestinian Black September group. 11 Israeli athletes were massacred. While the world mourned the dead, Mahler, who was on trial in a courtroom in West Berlin, charged with setting up a terrorist squad, made a speech to the court glorying in the killing. Mahler said the responsibility for the massacre lay with the fascist and imperialist governments of Israel and Germany. The Palestinians, he claimed, had shown the Red Army faction how to set about winning the People's War. This courageous example should be followed.
And I declared what the policy of the RAF should be. I thought that we should identify ourselves completely with the liberation movement of the Third World. It is not up to us to criticize them, and we should learn by them.
People will find it very difficult to understand the arrogance of a small group of people who think they know the solution to the problems, who are prepared to liberate a country by terrifying it with terrorism.
you say it is arrogance, but it is much more despair, because we tried to inform the people. We tried to protest peacefully. We tried to demonstrate and protest against a criminal policy of superpowers of the United States. And we had no success here in this country.
So then you thought, since you'd had no success, you should terrify the people.
It was not our opinion that we should terrify the people, because we always said our actions should be directed against the state apparatus, the authorities, the police, and the army.
But whatever Mahler planned backfired. The state he set out to destroy became more repressive, and the people he wanted to free didn't support the Red Army. They simply suffered tougher security measures. Another important part of his strategy went wrong. In court, Mahler had urged the Red Army faction to internationalism. It happened with chilling results.
Pacific Arab, we are international revolutionaries. I'm doing that. We are going to execute all the passengers and the crew. For international revolutionaries, we are international revolutionaries.
The pilot of this aircraft was murdered. At Mogadishu and Entebbe, the Palestinian and German terrorists joined to behave like those Mahler saw as fascists and fought to destroy.
But would you take moral responsibility for all the generation of terrorists who came after you?
Of course, because all these thoughts have a common ground of opinion and conviction and thinkings and discussions. And I took part in these discussions and I had these views. And so I'm, in a moral sense, responsible for all things which came out of this. But that doesn't mean that I'm now crushed or knocked down.
You don't feel crushed when you see that your followers, people who followed you, German terrorists who were at Entebbe and Mogadishu, selected Jews for special treatment. You who started this movement saying it's for anti-fascist purposes, and you see the people who you influenced doing the things that the Nazis did.
Okay, if you want to say it this way, this is the contradiction in this movement. If you have to fight with guns, there will be innocent people under the victims. And you must realize that it is quite impossible to think about freedom and liberation without accepting this possibility. And therefore, we felt ourselves justified in a moral sense.
Mahler, who hasn't admitted any of the terrorist charges brought against him, continues to rethink the revolution from his prison cell. He says that he no longer supports active terrorism, and 3 years ago he refused a chance to escape from prison. When the prominent West German politician Peter Lorenz was kidnapped to bargain the release of 5 terrorists, including Mahler, he refused to rejoin his friends. He saw terrorism as a dead end. Hans Becker, now out of jail after 7 years, draws his conclusions.
The revolution is only a shadow play. There is only a handful of people, maybe 100 or 1,000, or maybe even 1 million. It makes no difference at all. They have 59 million people against them who want to keep the state as it is. Whether this state is good or bad is worth a discussion, but it is not worth any terrorist action.
These people died in vain because you and a few of your friends thought you could change society. Do you ever feel shame for what happened?
That's not the right word, no. Because you may think it is some sort of easy answer when I say that our mistakes must be seen in a social and historical context. Maybe we are trained not to show compassion. We distrust compassion. we were convinced to do the right, even if there are victims. And this feeling and this conviction makes it impossible to feel ashamed.